Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the first panel of the 10th year of Urban Arc. It's a really exciting morning for us here at IHS, and I'm echoing heavily, so I'm going to stay away from this mic. But thank you all for coming, for joining online. We have a great, really interesting panel today. The first panel is called Making the Informal City, with a focus on migration and labor. And the papers that we have and the presenters that are speaking to us today um, have a really striking similarity in how they think about informality, right? Not as absence or disorder, but a mode of spatial production. And the relationship of that spatial production with labor is really the core focus. And I won't take any more time before getting into the presentations. We have 6 presenters today and 12 minutes to present each, and we'll have a long session at the end for questions and answers. So please, let's get straight into it. John Thomas from South Asia University will be speaking first, and we will just run your presentation online. Could we get John's a clicker?
The title of my Hello everyone. The title of my paper is Claiming Space, Making Place, Migrant Workers and the Contested Urban in Kerala. So this is part of my PhD thesis. So I'll just get straight into it. The the Kerala story of Kerala's development and Kerala's urban, it's often told through what is known as the Kerala model of development, uh, which is characterized by exceptional human development, strong state intervention, strong trade unions, and these things. But this celebratory narrative uh, often omits the migrant workers who are becoming an increasingly large part of the workforce in Kerala. So, in through this paper, I wanted to put focus on them, and uh, this works this work borrows heavily from Brenner, Robinson, and Patel, all these people, and their focus on the global south to rethink theory from our own context rather than looking at them as deviations from the northern cities. So the format of this paper is through an ethnographical case study of a protest march that was conducted by migrant workers from West Bengal in Kerala. This was one of the first local protests that was conducted by migrant workers in Kerala. So, and also through this paper, I will look at how the space that they inhabit uh, as laboring bodies, the cities that they inhabit, and how they are rarely allowed to make it their place. But what happens when they become political entities and when they take to the streets? How how is that contestation happening? So, uh, so uh, this is a case study of a group of construction workers in Kerala. So uh, they're from Murshidabad district in West Bengal. They have been uh, working in Kerala for like past 4 years, and the last 2 years they were working with a particular contractor, and uh, through their contact, one person who became like a job giver, or he brought his friends and neighbors into the work, and uh, they were working there. But over time, around 6 months payment was pending to this particular worker, and around 4 lakh rupees were pending to this particular workers. So what is crucial here for us to note is that there were both Malayali workers and migrant workers working under the same contractor, but only the payment for these migrant workers were lacking. And this is a familiar structure of precarity. The migrant workers who occupy the lowest rungs of the labor hierarchy, they are they lack this networks and linguistic fluency. And when exploitation occurs, the first response that they have is to leave and do work in another place. So it is at this juncture I got to know them through an organization who works for the migrant workers. And then through that we try to go to the labor office, and through different means we are trying to solve this issue. And but in the labor office, and this is a photo of us sitting outside the labor office trying to discuss how to move forward. But even in the labor office discussions, the contractor was saying that he needs more than 6 months more to pay these workers. He had already and this was a group of 8 workers, and they are daily wage laborers, so it's a very difficult scenario for them. And when they uh, after multiple meetings, when this issue was not being solved, then the migrant workers decided that they will go for a protest march to his house, to the house of the contractor. So there were two main reasons for this. The first reason was that to put like peer pressure on the contractor, so that his neighbors and people will say that why are you not paying these workers wages, and then uh, that was the main thing, and also to put media pressure on the contractor. So and after the meeting with in the labor office, uh, there were two main challenges for these migrant workers to conduct such a protest march. The first one was political mobilization, because this is a group of just 8 workers. If as I told you in the beginning, Kerala is known for its trade union and all, but they are all for local workers. Migrant workers don't have a trade union, they don't have any political participation and all these things. So the first question was that of political mobilization of people, and the second question was that of uh, entering into the gated community of the contractor. So that is also like a not an easy accessible space for the workers. So this paper in this paper I'm like trying to see how did they overcome these two challenges. The first challenge of mobilization, how they overcome is okay. There are spaces called Bengali Bazaar or Bengali Market in in Angamali, in these cities. These are the only places where they can act freely, where they eat their own food, and after a day's work they come back and sit there. It's not just a market, it is one of the few urban spaces where migrant workers are, they are not constantly watched, questioned, or pushed away. So while most of the city is hostile to them, they make small areas like this their own. So what they did was that they, as you can see, they made a poster, uh, and with this poster they entered into the market. So this is a in the right you see a photo of these workers going into the market. So as you can see, right when we entered the market, a lot of people started gathering and asking us what is the issue, what happened, uh, and and more stories of other workers also started coming up. Earlier, if there was any issue, if there was a case of non-payment, most of these workers did not have any other solution rather than to leave this job and to go to another job. But now they understood that they can go to the labor office, or there are many different avenues to this. So after that, this a lot of people joined for this protest march, and we took police permission and we went ahead with the protest march. As they're saying 5 minutes, I'll just go faster. So and when we entered into this uh, house of this uh, contractor, the house was closed. There was nobody there, but the other residents and all started coming up and saying, "This is a place where decent people live. Why are you guys coming here?" And that also at this time, and and the police stopped us there, and then we turned back. So during in this paper, I am also mentioning how migrant workers who clean the city, who make the buildings, when they travel together as a political entity, how the city also looks at them. And what happened in the aftermath of this protest was that the contractor's mother gave a police complaint saying that these people vandalized the their house and property, and the residents also gave a complaint against the police and all. And the police who accompanied us, they said that we want to help them, but there is we are living in colonial era laws, so we can't do anything. That's what the police directly told us. And So that issue is it's still happening. So and the police officer said this, if you are going around this courts or labor offices, it's fine, but when you when you gather and march the migrant workers, these are people who live in chicken houses, that is that, like in short cramped spaces. How can you control their anger? So these are the issues that came up in the police station. So this it, for migrant workers, it is mostly a set of hostile spaces, worksite, labor nakas, crowded rooms, police stations, but where they are tolerated and but they are not welcome. But there are still spaces like the Bengali bazaar here where they can become political entities, where they can organize. So people who are engaging with the urban and with mobilization and all, we have to give importance to these spaces. Uh, we have to give importance to these spaces on how to organize them. And uh, the and there are three takeaways that I am thinking from this. First is that the protest should be understood as a spatial act. It is not only a demand for wages or justice, it is a reworking of urban boundaries. When migrant workers walks through streets or attempt to step into gated colonies, they unsettle the everyday distinction between the guest and the resident, between those who merely work in the city and those who are seen as belonging to it. This march converts the bodies that are usually meant to remain invisible into visible political subjects. In doing so, it temporarily redefines who has the right to appear in public space. And the second takeaway that I want to show is that the scale is not neutral. This worker struggle move across multiple terrains, from the contractor's house to labor office to police station and finally on the streets. In each shift alt, is a change in the balance of power. And uh, I also want to draw how a single local event opens up new political imaginaries for the migrant workers in the city. For many participants, this was the first time that they realized that the injustice could be named and there can be some action taken against it. Even though these imaginaries are immediately contested by the state and resident communities, they do not disappear. They often leave a trace of possibility. So in this paper, I am not going. I do not want to offer any solutions or something, but under such conditions of extreme precarity, uh, a momentary uh, march in migrant workers that transform the urban space into a site of belonging and contestation. Through this protest, they do not merely move through the city, but they remake it. And even though, however briefly, they make a change. Challenge. Okay.
I'll ask the next presenter to speak. And I think this presenter is joining us online, Neha Kumari, whose presentation and paper is called Redefining Urban Dynamics, Exploring the Linkages Between Migration, Slums, and Gig Work. So,
Why study housing and gig workers together? So, before getting into my argument, I want to explain why I felt the need to study this topic. Over the last decade, Indian cities have seen a rapid rise in the gig work, especially app based work jobs like food delivery, ride hailing, and courier services. These jobs are often presented as flexible and accessible, particularly for migrants who come to cities in search of work. At the same time, cities like Delhi are facing a deep and long-standing housing crisis. Affordable and secure housing is extremely limited, especially for low-income migrants workers. As a result, many workers are pushed into slums and unauthorized colonies or informal rental agreements where living conditions are insecure and eviction is always a possibility. What is important to note that these two processes are happening together, but they are rarely studied together. Gig work is usually discussed as labor issue, focusing on wages, flexibility, and platform algorithms. Housing, on the other hand, is studied as a planning or policy problem, focusing on slums, evictions, and housing strategies. So when we look at these issues separately, we miss how they shape each other in everyday life. For example, unstable income from gig work affects people can live, and insecure housing affects how much and how hard people work. This paper starts from the idea that to understand gig work properly, we also need to understand where gig workers live. And to understand housing insecurity, we also need to look at the kinds of the work people are forced to do to survive in the city. This connection is what motivates the study. So since the time is running low, I'll be not discussing the key terms used in this paper, but I just specifically wants to like mention this statement. Because here we are not using housing as an infrastructural facility, but as a social basis on which we will study the like situations of gig workers. So I'll be skipping this slide, uh, like the terms, and that will go into the research problem and the gap. So there is now a growing body of literature on platform-based gig work, which highlights issues such as income instability, lack of social security, and algorithmic control. At the same time, there is a long-standing and rich scholarship on urban housing insecurity and informal settlement in Indian cities, particularly in relation to migrants. However, what become evident from the reviewing these bodies of work is that they are largely operate in isolation. Gig work is mostly analyzed as labor market issue, while the housing insecurity is treated as a problem of urban planning or poverty. As a result, the everyday interaction between the housing and the unexplored and the work is in the lives of migrant workers remain underexplored, which in particular there is a limited attention to how informal housing conditions shape everyday socio-economic experiences such as work intensity, commuting and mobility, access to welfare and social benefits, and the fulfillment of basic needs. So, this analytical separation produces an incomplete understanding of urban precarity in the context of gig worker and gig economy. Addressing this gap is important not only for the advancing academic debates, but also for designing research that can meaningfully capture the live realities of migrant gig workers. This gap forms the starting point of the present we are doing today. So, yeah. This slide captures the central idea of my paper, the key argument that housing insecurity and gig work are not separate problems. They actively shape and reinforce each other. Let me explain this step by step. Many migrant workers live in informal or insecure housing because this is cheap, flexible, and does not require formal documentation. This kind of housing makes it possible for workers to survive in the city even when their income is very low and unstable. This is where the gig work comes in. Gig work offers income, but the income is unpredictable and insecure. Workers do not receive housing support, job security, or long term stability. Because of this, they cannot move into a better or more secure housing. At the same time, housing insecurity puts constant pressure on workers to keep earning. Rent has to be paid every month, regardless of how much they earn. As a result, the workers often stay logged into platforms for long hours and accept unfavorable situations and conditions to work in and remain dependent on the gig work. So what we see is a cycle of that informal housing allows gig work to function by keeping the labor cost low, and gig work in turn keeps workers trapped in an informal housing because it does not provide stability. So this diagram shows the cycle my paper focuses on. Informal housing allows workers to survive on unstable incomes. Gig work provides income but no stability or housing support. Because of this, the workers remain dependent on the informal housing and the cycle continues. This is why the paper argues that the housing insecurity is not just a background issue, it is a structural condition that enables the gig economy. And once we see this connection, the next question is how we should think about it analytically. So this slide explains how I'm thinking about the relationship between the housing insecurity and the gig work. I'm so sorry. Is the slide moving?
We
Is
can
this?
see housing as a structural condition.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Great. So yeah, and this slide explains how I'm thinking about the relationship between the housing insecurity and the gig work. First, I treat housing as a structural condition. This means housing is not just a place where people live after work. The level of security or insecurity in housing shapes how much risk workers can take, how many hours they can work, and whether they can refuse unsafe or poorly paid jobs. Secondly, I conceptualize informal housing as an urban infrastructure. Slums and informal settlements are often discussed as problems, but in practice, they support the functionality of the city by housing workers who keep the urban service running. Without these settlements, many forms of low paid work, including the gig work, would not be possible in cities like Delhi. Third, I understand the gig work as an extension of informality, not a break from it. While gig work appears modern and technology driven, it relies on the same condition of insecurity, flexibility, and lack of protection that have a long characterized informal labor. Digital platforms reorganizes this informality rather than removing it. So bringing these three ideas together allows me to analyze housing insecurity and gig work as a part of a single urban system rather than the two separate problems. So since this is the part of my ongoing doctoral research and the time is very limited, I'll be skipping the methodology part, which like what I which method I'm going to use for my future fieldwork and everything. And we will move on to the slide 8 directly. That what research questions and objective I have like finalized for this. Given this research gap, the paper is guided by a central research question that asks how housing insecurity shapes the everyday socio-economic experiences of migrant workers. And at this stage, the objective is not to present empirical findings, but to critically engage with existing literature and develop a conceptual framework that will guide future qualitative fieldwork. And in slide line, based on the conceptual framing and the research design, the study focuses on the four key analytical themes. I want to emphasize that these are anticipated themes and not the finalized findings, as the primary fieldwork is still ongoing. The first thing, look at the rent pressure and the work intensity. Housing costs are fixed and unavoidable, while income from gig work is unstable. This creates pressure on workers to work long hours, accept unfavorable incentives, and remain continuously available on the platforms. The second theme examines informal housing as labor infrastructure. Informal settlements are not just places where workers live, they actively support gig work by providing affordable and flexible housing that makes low and unstable incomes viable in the city. The third theme focuses on the spatial marginality and platform dependence. Workers living in peripheral or poorly connected areas may become more dependent on specific platforms, zones, or incentives, which increase their vulnerability to algorithmic control. Finally, the study paid attention to layered precarity shaped by gender and caste. Housing and labor insecurity are not experienced in the same way by all the workers. Gender safety concerns, mobility restrictions, and caste-based occupational segregation further shapes how precarity is lived and negotiated. Together, these themes allow the study to examine housing insecurity and gig work as interconnected dimensions of the urban precarity. And moving on to my last slide, I want to conclude by clarifying that this paper does not and what this paper does, and equally importantly, what it set out to do next. Based on the critical engagement while with existing literature, this paper shows that while gig work and urban housing insecurity have both been extensively studied, their everyday interaction and intersection have in the lives of migrant gig workers remain insufficiently examined. In particular, the literature does not adequately explain how informal housing conditions shape daily work practices, mobility, and commuting, access to social benefits, social security, and fulfillment of basic needs. So, by bringing housing and labor together analytically, this paper reframes housing insecurity not as a background condition, uh, but as a structural factor that shapes everyday socio-economic vulnerability within the gig economy. And at the same time, it highlights how platform-based workers reproduces and sustains housing insecurity by offering unstable incomes and limited protection. Importantly, this paper does not claim to offer a final empirical conclusions. Instead, its contribution lies in identifying conceptual and analytical gaps in existing scholarships and in the developing a framework that helps clarify why we focus on qualitative research is necessary. So, these insights directly inform the next stage of my doctoral research, which will involve primarily qualitative fieldwork to examine how migrant gig workers experience housing insecurity in their everyday life and how this shapes their work, mobility, and access to welfare. To conclude, the paper argues that understanding the gig economy requires moving beyond the platforms and algorithms to examine the urban conditions, particularly housing, that make such work possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you for that presentation. Uh, Moving on to the next presenters that are Nivedita and Geeta Tatra, whose presentation is called Geographies of Exclusion, Migrant Workers, and the Changing Industrial Geography of Surat. I believe they're both joining us online. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I am going to jump right into the presentation given the paucity of time. Our paper is titled Geographies of Exclusion, Migrant Workers and the Changing Industrial Geography of Surat. This paper broadly examines the spatial reconfiguration of Surat and its industry and how this is shaping labor regimes and the lived experiences of the migrant labor employed in these industries in the urban peripheries of Surat. Next slide, please. Surat, as many of you may be aware, is a major and a bustling synthetic textile manufacturing hub in the western part of India. And it is heavily dependent on cheap migrant labor from eastern India, predominantly Odisha and Bihar. Okay. So just to sort of introduce Surat itself, Surat, as many of you may know, is a very bustling textile, artificial synthetic textile manufacturing hub in Western India, and the industry itself has historically been reliant on cheap migrant labor, predominantly from Odisha, but also Bihar and UP. The textile industry itself in Surat is highly fragmented into different subsectors like the powerloom industry, the printing and the dyeing industries, etc. And I would be focusing on the powerloom industry itself to show how the powerloom industry, which is already situated in a very weak labor industrial regulatory paradigm, also has very precarious working conditions. And what does this mean when the industry has been experiencing spatial relocation to the urban peripheries in the northern areas of the Surat? What does this mean for the migrant workers that are employed in these industries? To quickly just sort of show what kind of research questions I'll try to broadly address in this presentation. Firstly, would be to show what are the kind of processes that are reconfiguring the space of Surat itself, and what are the processes that have driven the powerloom industry to the urban periphery. And secondly, to then move to the urban periphery itself and look at what are the sort of urban and labor governance institutions, how are they interacting with each other, and what are the kind of institutional ambiguities that are producing, which are then shaping migrant workers' access to services and also labor protection in the industry. And finally, to see how this industrial relocation is also reshaping the labor regimes within the powerloom industry, and what does this imply for migrant workers. I will just say that the we have heavily drawn from the scholarship on space to understand how the urban core and the periphery are not abstract static spaces, but they are mutually and relationally constituted spaces. And also the Marxist geography framework on capitalist restructuring helps to understand how capital relocates to areas with cheaper land and cheaper labor through spatial strategies, often supported by state-led planning, and to expand capital accumulation. Briefly, in terms of methodology, we've adopted a mixed methodology here. Historical and spatial analysis was also combined with fieldwork that was conducted between December 2022 to August 2023 across five peripheral industrial clusters outside Surat. This included qualitative surveys with workers, about 90 workers, and also group discussions, and also in-depth interviews with a wide range of actors such as industry representatives, planning authorities, governance officials, and academic experts. Just to sort of situate Surat spatially, so what you see here are like very crudely drawn, hand-drawn maps of how Surat has experienced growth. Surat as a city has experienced urban expansion over the years, and the image on the right sort of shows how the powerloom industrial clusters have also spatially dispersed over the years. So in 1961, in the area that you see below in the core, the area under the black line that has demarcated the area under Surat in 1960s. So most of the powerloom industries were contained in this area. But over time, as the city has expanded, as the city has grown, the powerloom industries have also dispersed spatially. It becomes important to locate the current spatial relocation of the industry historically, because this is not the first time a spatial relocation is happening. So you can move to the next slide. Yeah. So Surat city and the powerloom industry specifically experienced spatial expansion, especially in the 60s to the 80s period, under the Nehruvian urban industrial policies and the local residential zoning laws. So in this period, there were changes in this spatial shift. There were changes in the organization of the industry, which meant the changes in relations of production, the kind of demography of the workforce. Situating the current relocation within such a context helped to understand what we can expect in terms of how labor regimes will be reshaped in the coming years. And I quickly want to move to what is specifically happening right now in Surat, which is that as these powerloom industries are spatially dispersing gradually over the last few decades, we also see that this is now being strengthened through the urban policies in Surat. So the Surat Urban Development Authority draws land use policy framework, which is a vision for how they envision development and planning until 2035. And the Surat Development Authority has designated industrial shifting zones where dense textile clusters in the urban core of the industry, in the image that we saw previously, these are now being relocated to northern regions outside the city. So what this means is this is also happening at a time when industrial associations have also been lobbying for cheaper land outside the city. So what we really see happening is that the urban development strategies have been producing new spatial forms for capital accumulation in cheaper lands outside the city. And I think this is best sort of understood in this quote right here by one of the workers, who says that the machines are moving out of the city. That means that the workers also have to move out. And so it remains to be seen what happens to these migrant workers when they move out of the city. So quickly moving to the urban labor governance, the sort of space in the peripheries. These peripheral areas are yet to be subsumed under the Surat Urban Development Authority. So right now they're being governed under transitional arrangements. So the panchayat then becomes responsible for planning and development. And as we all know from examples across other peripheral industrialization and planning and development, this often happens through irregular means. there are differences across the cities and the panchayats where approval for industrial development becomes more flexible. The zoning laws are less strict, which means factories have been able to set up larger shop floors than what is actually allowed within the cities. And as we can also see in the quote here, the power loom units are clearly seen as something that fall outside the panchayat's jurisdiction for industrial regulation and labor oversight. And this becomes important to understand because most of the power loom industries in Surat historically have been registered under the Shops and Establishment Act. And what that means is that the local urban governance authority, which is in this case the panchayat, becomes the regulatory authority for basic regulations for safety conditions, for labor protection, etc. And the panchayat, which is already so burdened by the growing industrialization, its activities, its regulatory activities have been limited to tax collection, filing FIRs against industrialists. And this also becomes important to understand in a context where when you're moving out of the city, the small scale character of the power loom industry is changing. So a power loom unit in Surat would be as small as holding 24 to say 40 machines, in a particular unit. But in a factory, as you go outside the city, each of these factories are large factories. So the size is anywhere between say 150 to 600 machines, and such a scale is unprecedented in Surat's history of industrialization. So what this means is that even though the scale is significantly different, the factories continue to fragment, to partition their factories, and fragmentation continues to remain a norm. Okay, so between all of this that's happening, it becomes important to sort of understand if labor processes are being reorganized in the peripheries and how so. Because before we started the study, there's been a lot of speculation that new capital and advanced machinery in the peripheries, in these larger factories in the peripheries, would lead to formalization of work, would alter how work is even organized in these industries. However, our findings from the ground show that there's been no substantive change in how labor is organized. So workers continue to be, continue to operate on really informal work arrangements. There is no proof of employment, and they're all, invisibilized on payrolls. So despite the scale of the factories, social protection remains largely absent, and informality persists. Are the slides visible for everyone else?
No, we're just
Okay.
listening to you.
Okay. What we see happening now is that there are definite changes in the relations of production in these large factories. So, the factory scale has expanded, which has intensified work and also labor disciplining in these factories. So, workers find themselves having no spaces for negotiation in these large factories. And there's also been an increase in surveillance, and working hours have lengthened, and workers operate way more machines for the same amount of wages. Since these are large factories, workers who would previously operate anywhere between 8 to 10 machines now operate 12 to sometimes 20 machines in a given work shift for the same amount of wages. So while they move to large factories with very informal work conditions, the exploitation has intensified in these factories. Just next slide. So in terms of what something new that's emerging in the peripheries is a blurring of work and residential spaces, because these are areas that have sparse accommodation facilities. What we see happening is that the employer is providing housing for the workers, which means that these employer provided housing then becomes spaces for labor control. So workers find their bargaining spaces, their spaces for collective agency and bargaining reducing further, because they are expected to maintain flexible working hours, and also crucial thing is the fact that they spend their the whole day within the power looms, cramped with the constant noise of the power looms that leads to partial reproduction of labor. Finally, I would just like to say say that these are industrial clusters that are very remote, spatially dispersed, and this has led to a sense of alienation for workers because they are now cut off from access to networks, access to spaces for collective organization, and just any form of information. So it has really led to weakening of unionization efforts for these workers. In terms of conclusion, you can just retain. Yeah, you can retain this slide. So the industrial peripheries in Surat are not spillover. They have to be understood as a planned outcome of urban development and capitalist accumulation processes. So these peripheries that we see in Surat, they're still under construction, which means that they are still marked by overlapping governance and institutional ambiguity. And while all of this is happening, the historical gaps and lack of effective implementation of the Factories Act has enabled the continued informalization and fragmentation of the industry, even in the peripheries. And at the same time, this has also led to intensifying labor disciplining and spatial control over the workers. So, on the whole, the migrant powerloom workers are rendered further invisible and disposable within this spatial restructuring of the city and the industry. And I would like to conclude it with these quotes.
Okay, thank you so much, Nivedita. That was an excellent presentation. And thanks for carrying on despite all the technical glitches that were happening. Okay. Like I said, I'll reserve my comments for for after all the presentations are done. So next is Satya. Satya Oza, who's from Ahmedabad University, who also used to be an urban fellow with us many years ago. So it's very exciting to see him back.
I'd like to thank the IHS and also the rickshaw union leaders who actually invited me to some of their meetings. And with that, I begin my slides. So basically, what I want to argue is that yeah, this paper basically attempts to answer the following question: how do gig auto rickshaw unions and drivers use urban space to create strategies of resistance against the precarities caused by the platform economy? So I've used ethnographic methods such as participant observation and interviews to argue that auto rickshaw drivers and unions essentially use urban commons. It could be public gardens, it could be footpaths, it could be open spaces to meet, organize, and strategize against companies such as Ola, Uber, and Rapido. So I kind of introduced the concept of Jagya. Jagya is a very Gujarati term which a lot of rickshaw driver unions and rickshaw drivers use to as a counter to location. So I'll be explaining a bit about what they are. And basically, what I want to argue is that these urban commons are Jagyas of collective action. And within the specific context of Ahmedabad, this Jagya becomes an analytical tool to highlight the agency and knowledge systems, spatial knowledge systems of gig workers in the global south against a system which is increasingly controlled by algorithms. So my first experience with this definition or with this dichotomy of Jagya and location came by a rickshaw driver who even though he had known my location, he said that no, I want to know your Jagya because I know how I can take you through the routes which often are wrong in these platforms. So given that, and I then started digging further, and that's the part of my thesis. I want to introduce auto rickshaws. So auto rickshaws are the key instrument of paratransit in Ahmedabad with a history of over 6 decades. As of 2021, there are around 2.1 lakh rickshaws, and their interests are kind of negotiated through 11 different registered rickshaw unions. And this is a sector of significant change. It's very dynamic. The internal changes and external changes, with an increase in auto rickshaw drivers in the past few years, and also the arrival of digital platforms in the past 6 or 7 years, which is the central focus. These arrival of digital platforms have brought in precarities such as income precarities because the wages keep on going up and down. There's an increasing competition because now you have these new system of bike taxis which have come. There are government regulations which, according to rickshaw drivers, support the proliferation of digital platforms and the exploitation of rickshaw drivers. And there's algorithmic control through maps. Space matters here, as we have already discussed, through digital platforms because because algorithmic control of because the digital platforms have algorithmic control of routes, information and locate information of locations of customers and related fares. But on the other hand, there's also space with regards to unions. Each union has their own adda within the city, and these different competing unions don't go into each other's addas. So given that there's such a fragmented space, physical and bargaining in the city, my central question became, where does formal collective action actually happen? So my entire research is divided is framed within like these two broad fields. One is labor geography, where I found something very interesting, which Herod talks about, that space is not just is reproduced through practice, and it's not just a unilateral capitalist accumulation, but it's also workers' agency. Like there's a constant workers are constantly contesting against it and creating space through practice. And another concept that I found interesting was counter spaces, which are basically spaces that resist or challenge the dominant neo-capitalist conceived space that dominate urban life. The second broad literature strand that I am looking at is resistance in the gig economy. There's a huge there's been increasing literature that has been written about the potential for solidarities that happen because of spatial proximity and temporal synchronicity in digital and physical spaces. While this is a lot of this research has been European, and a lot of research that is coming up in India looks at the role of gig worker unions, especially the Telangana Gig and Platform Workers Union, and the role of space. The role of space is something that has not been highly thought about. Hussein does talk about the role of restaurants and the space outside restaurants to organize. But I wanted to specifically focus on urban commons because that's where I saw a lot of gatherings that were happening with rickshaw drivers. And there was also a lack of vernacular worker defined spatial concepts. So that is something that I wanted to highlight through my research. So my research central research question that is driving here is, how are urban commons mobilized as spaces of labor resistance against the gig economy? And I kind of introduced this concept called jagyas, which are not just mere locations, but they are lived and experiential. And this lived and experiential spaces are basically the knowledge systems of rickshaw drivers. So, as against algorithmic control and surveillance, jagya is a kind of a political concept embodied in collective actions and knowledge of rickshaw drivers and their unions. So the methodology that I've looked at is qualitative. It's a part of my ongoing doctoral fieldwork, May 2025 onwards. My position ID was as a researcher and activist. I did a lot of work for some of these unions, and so they would themselves call me to observe and to document the meetings that were happening. So the larger context in which these meetings were happening were two things. One, the motor vehicle aggregator guidelines 2025 were passed, and some of the clauses that were there were found very objectionable by these rickshaw drivers and the unions. And the second was this arrival of a new model of digital platform. So there's a new model that has come that is based on cooperativism, and so there were some unions who were supporting it and considered it as an active resistance against this current venture capital driven model of Ola, Uber, and Rapido. So what I want to show is this is a map of some of the meetings that I attended. As you can see, there are these meetings attended across the city. Uh, the second thing that I wanted to highlight was I will be focusing on three such meetings. One was on a footpath outside a garden where there is an access to parking. Why was this chosen? So basically, I would ask these union leaders, why did you choose this particular location for this particular meeting? So this was a footpath outside a public garden. They chose it because there was an access to a parking space. The location was kind of central to a lot of middle class customers who use Ola, Uber, Rapido. So, on one hand, they were protesting against Ola, Uber, Rapido, but on the other hand, this location was important because of its vicinity to Ola, Uber, Rapido customers. This was a small meeting with limited members of one union. The second meeting was at a public garden, an AMC public garden, and this was a big meeting with around 20-25 participants. It was dotted with tea stalls and snack shops, which was essential for a big meeting of around 2 to 2.5 hours. And this was a political meeting. It was a central location and agreeable to all unions across the city. And the third was this open, empty space which was unmarked and undeveloped on the peripheries of Ahmedabad. And it was important because it was not just a meeting amongst rickshaw drivers, but also between rickshaw drivers and taxi drivers. This was close to the airport and hence always utilized by taxi drivers and rickshaw drivers. It was an important place of rest. So typically taxi drivers would come to rest and to just relax over here. So essentially what I want to argue is, what do these jagyas entail? These are urban commons, and these jagyas entail basically collective solidarity across fragmented unions towards a common cause. The common cause is the exploitation again, exploitation caused by Ola, Uber, Rapido through decreasing fares, through arrival of bike taxis, which is causing a lot of income shortages or which is causing a lot of problems for rickshaw drivers and taxi drivers. And it is also important for a sector whose collective action has very limited financial resources. So most of these unions do not have money to rent out a hall. And so that is why these urban commons such as open spaces, gardens, and footpaths become an important meeting point. At the same time, Jagyas are not just a place for solidarity, but it's also contestation and negotiation. Why negotiation? Because on one hand, we are protesting against Ola, Uber, Rapido. By the same time, these spaces are also important uh, because yeah, just there's just a conclusion slide that is remaining. So Jagyas become kind of a negotiation and contestation space with algorithmic spatial control. It's not just a spatial practice but also temporal resistance, because as against a platform which is constantly trying to get you to take rides, these spaces become place to rest, pause, and time to think. And these jagyas are of different types: formal, recognized and unrecognized by the government, but known by the rickshaw drivers. Uh, so my final concluding slide is to look at urban commons not just as passive spaces such as for walking and leisure, but as also politicizing this leisure and rest and making it a problem of collective action. It's also a question of choice. A lot of rickshaw union leaders say that we would prefer a hall, but since we do not have a money, we don't have money, we have to use this. And this concept of Jagya, I want to highlight foregrounds, worker spatial agency, and knowledge. Uh, and yeah, the future question that I want to understand is, how do we understand these diverse urban commons? Because these are three different kinds of urban commons that we saw. So in my further qualitative research, I would really like to see how these three different spaces create three different kind of everyday realities of transport workers, and also the limitations and tensions to these jagyas. What happens when one union leader is having a meeting at the same space where another union leader wants to have? These so even these urban commons have their own logics of exclusion, hierarchies, and gender. So that would be something that I want to study in my future research. So yeah, thank you so much. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Satya. Thank you for that. Um, I'm moving on to Shirija, who's also presenting on an gig work. So Shirija is an independent researcher, and the name of her presentation is Deregulating the City, Online Food Delivery Platforms, Precarious Labor, and Bangalore's Urban Landscape. So go right ahead.
Thank you, Aditi. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. It feels like a very pertinent time to be talking about this with the Labour Ministry mandating platform apps to drop the 10-minute delivery deadlines, which is very welcome news, so rare these days. I will maybe begin by flagging that this is very much a work in progress paper, so please bear with me. On that note, let's get into it. So, Swiggy, one of India's most popular food delivery platforms, was launched in Bangalore in 2014. At the time, the online food delivery market was considered both overcrowded and unviable. By 2018, Swiggy had reached a billion-dollar valuation, a success that is credited to the app's extensive logistics network, the fleet of delivery drivers that is now a recurring motif across the urban Indian streetscape. Drivers who Swiggy, Zomato, and other apps term delivery executives, delivery partners, or hunger saviors, never employees or workers. Today, the food delivery market in India is valued at $62 billion, with urban India accounting for around 70% of consumption. Swiggy tied food delivery services in India to the platform economy model, transforming not only the market, but also the country's urban fabric in the process. Organized food delivery systems have existed since the late 19th century, originating, in fact, in a rapidly urbanizing colonial Bombay with the Dabbawalas. Using a system of color coded tiffin boxes, the service evolved into a complex citywide geographical network. In the 1990s, pizza chains like Domino's entered the market and soon became forerunners in delivery, which at the time was mostly independent restaurants running their own local delivery services, often carried out by workers employed in other service roles. What differentiates the platform based food delivery market is not only its expanded scale of operations, but the emergence of what scholars term digital geographies, characterized by the algorithmic blurring of spatial and temporal lines. Providing a marketplace that connects consumer demand to restaurant supply and the labor of gig workers, these platforms rely on GIS to curate restaurants and delivery routes. As the anthropologist Tulasi Srinivas describes it, locality is no longer central to theorizing food and taste. Instead, the location of the consumer shifts the meaning of the local to a geographical and cartographic sense rather than a cultural one. Taste is delinked from place and moved from the food itself to the consumer, from object to subject. Like most platform app startups, Swiggy's real asset is its massive database. In 2019, Dale Vaz, then the head of engineering and data science, described using AI and machine learning models to predict the ETA of an order and to create dynamic mapping systems for delivery routes. Apart from profiting off consumer data, which is made possible by a glaring lack of data privacy laws, Swiggy's use of geospatial data to refine its own algorithms also produces cartographic representations of urban space rooted in platform capitalism. In 2022, Pradnya Karbhari, then the VP of Engineering at Swiggy, described the company's doorstep delivery service. While ride-hailing services like Uber are tethered to spatial location, the peaking demand during mealtime slots drives food delivery apps to prioritize locational accuracy to maximize profitability. So the quicker and more seamless the delivery, the more deliveries that can be conducted during these peak slots. Karbhari also mentions that the search radius for restaurants, anchored by the consumer's location, is altered based on the number of delivery partners in the area. And I think this poses an interesting angle with which to consider Srinivas's framing of the local, where it is not only the location of the consumer or the subject that determines food landscapes, but also the supply of labor at any given time, at any given location that delineates it. A middle party that is neither the subject or object of this culinary transaction, yet facilitates the entire ecosystem. To provide these promised quick turnaround times, Swiggy has already been relying on AI powered real time traffic mapping for years to suggest quicker delivery routes for workers, creating ways of moving through the city that override local spatial knowledge. Additionally, the company's tech blog reveals the various interventions conducted in order to polish the delivery experience. Oh, perfect. Swiggy relies heavily on large repositories of open source data, including crowdsourced mapping platforms like OpenStreetMaps or OSM. OSM offers a cost effective evaluation specifically of two-wheeler travel distances, whereas other mapping services offer only four-wheeler distances at lower rates. So, the specific kind of labor and the tools attached to it determine the foundation of the company's cartographic interventions. In 2021, the company posted about their efforts to identify and mine points of interest, or POIs, which are geographical locations that could represent public or private spaces like hospitals, residential complexes, commercial spaces, and so on. These spaces are densely located in urban areas, and they can also be marked inconsistently on open source platforms. Using order density and machine learning algorithms, Swiggy developed its own algorithmic polygons that refine these POIs based on the company's metrics. In the image on the slide, you can see how the two pink algorithmic polygons overlap with the satellite imagery based polygons on the map. Swiggy then uses these algorithmic POIs to refine delivery grouping, suggest routes or entry gates into the POIs, and to offer targeted promotions for consumers in the POI. In 2022, they posted about their work on minimizing the dissonance between a consumer's typed address and their actual location, wherein the route traversed by the delivery worker and the location where they marked an order as delivered were used to synthesize a median location on the map, which would then be used to make subsequent deliveries seamless. In 2025, their interventions extended to further refining delivery routes, particularly in the context of their more recently launched quick commerce service. The company used historical first mile and last mile delivery trips to assess road quality available on OpenStreetMaps and address missing road segments, missing connectivity, incorrect travel directions as represented on the map. Delivery workers, especially those engaged in gig work, perform what Donald Anderson calls spatial labor, traversing boundaries of public and private space and connecting them, as he puts it, physically, experientially, and through representation. He describes how this contributes to the production and reproduction of the Lefebvrean conception of social space through, and I quote, physical movement from one place to another, the experience of this movement, and the articulation of these places, experiences, and movements with visions of society and of the social. Using Swiggy's geospatial tech interventions as a springboard, we can build upon this framework of spatial labor, where delivery workers contribute to the production of social space through their movement across a city, but their labor also generates the data that informs the production of new cartographic records or representations of urban space. These then become new ways of reading urban geographies under platform capitalism. The workers then are also knowledge producers of these geographies, which fortify the tech and financial framework of the platform economy. The nature of the street, too, is altered, where a quintessentially public space takes on the nature of an ever changing place of work, serving not only a single private entity, but the entire ecosystem of global platform capital. The deregulation of the labor model permeates to the material urban space, where labor produces surplus value and knowledge on a daily basis, yet the worker is completely invisibilized. This transformation is contextualized further with the increasing occupational hazards of gig work. In just 1 week in November 2024, the Bangalore Traffic Police had reportedly registered over 17,000 cases against delivery workers alone for traffic safety violations. Bangalore's crumbling public infrastructure and road congestion makes the mounting pressure on delivery workers even more dangerous. Visually, too, the street becomes a de facto advertisement space, with t shirts, delivery carriers, and vehicles becoming mobile hoardings, ones that require no permission, regulation, or remuneration. The multiplicity of roles that the street plays in the platform economy is complemented by the proliferation of the non place, a concept that includes cloud kitchens, and dark stores. For example, a quick investigation by a blogger, Prashant Bed, found that the place that you see on this image was registered on licenses for nearly 200 restaurants on Swiggy. The conception of the street then is more fraught than ever, which brings me back also to the idea of what constitutes a local food landscape and culture. The screenshots you see here are all options filtered by the tag gourmet in 3 different locations of the city, in Jayanagar, Koramangala, and Cooktown. Note the repetition of restaurant options like ITC Sunfeast Baked Creations, Gourmet Ice Cream Cakes by Baskin Robbins, and Punjab Grill. This constructed homogeneity is even more apparent in comparisons across cities, like these menus from Bangalore, Chennai, and Navi Mumbai. This sense of a homogeneous culture of eating, despite a hyper-local service provided by the platform, is something I'm hoping to explore further as I carry some of this research on. I'm also hoping to supplement a lot of what I have so far with on-the-ground reports of spatial experiences of delivery workers. In May 2025, Karnataka passed an ordinance to provide social security and welfare benefits to gig and platform app workers. While this is a welcome move, it is important to note both that deregulation of the labor model is not addressed head on, and that the policies and regulations do not begin to address the implications of platform capitalism on the urban landscape and the built environment. The number of gig workers in India is projected to be nearly 24 million by 2030, which entails staggering levels of precarity. There is, of course, a dire need for stronger labor regulations, but I hope to build a stronger case also for provisions in these policies that account for the spatial consequences of the platform economy. I also hope that this might contribute towards building more efficient strategies for organizing and resistance, offering ways to rethink some of our approaches to unionizing in the gig labor context. And I think this sort of ties into what Satya was talking about, as well as Jones was talking about resistance really being a spatial act. With that, I will take your leave and thank you for your time.
Thank you for that. I think all of these presentations so far have been really generative. We have one last presentation before we get into our discussion, and that's Akash joining us, who's at Gautam Buddha University. Akash, are you online?
Yes.
Hi, we can see you. Want to share screen and start? Akash's presentation is called Contested Terrains at the Village City Edge, Migration Classification and Socio-Spatial Negotiation in Muzaffarnagar in Uttar Pradesh.
Good morning, everyone. So, my paper title is Contested Terrain at the City Village Edge, in which migration, classification, and social special negotiations are happening in Muzaffarnagar, Uttar Pradesh, India. Uh, Coming to the introduction, I begin with the proposition that the City Village Edge is a site of a theory. Following Doring Massey, I view this space as a product of interrelation, where the state's attempt to classify land meets the migrant struggle to claim it. A central question is, how is this informal city manufactured in the gap between these two forces? As we all know, that peri-urban fringes in India are not static lines but contested terrains where migration, caste, and systems of special classifications are colliding. This research uses Muzaffarnagar as a case to understand what is happening at the periphery and how these sense of belongings are renegotiated against the backdrop of infrastructure change, planning logics, and migration. So, in this map, you can also see that Muzaffarnagar is very near to Delhi. It is 120 kilometers north to Delhi, and also comes under a National Capital Region (NCR). And you could see from these statistics that the city population in 2021 was 392,000, and for 2021 it is 750,000, and for Master Plan 31 it has been projected for 10,60,000 people. So currently it is a medium town, but in 2031 it will no longer be a medium town. So, if we talk about the regional context, so Muzaffarnagar is historically anchored by agro industries like sugar and jaggery, and it is now being reshaped by massive regional projects like dedicated freight corridor (DFCs), new state highways, and rapid rail transit expansion. So, we can see that Muzaffarnagar is at a turning point. Driven by Master Plan of 2031, the city is set to engulf 25 surrounding villages, and this infrastructure led growth triggers leapfrog sprawl, informal subdivision of farmlands, which is transforming rural landscapes into a patchwork of unauthorized labor dormitories. In this map, you could see that after 2021, there are three patterns of settlements which is emerging on the peripheries of the cities. The first one, which is towards the west of the city in the red dots, it is informal settlements which are unregularized. Towards towards the southwest, there are gated plan developments, and towards the north, we have formalized but unplanned settlements. Yes. And we can see that the special analysis reveals a splintered urbanism. The east and southern are defined by gated plan developments with impermeable boundaries for high income groups. The west is characterized by informal, precarious settlements for migrants. The physical form of Muzaffarnagar reflect this deep socio-economic hierarchies. Gated colonies in the east fragments connectivity and reinforce exclusion. Meanwhile, the western edge houses the labor force in which are unauthorized, unregularized colony devoid of formal infrastructure. This pattern of socio-special exclusion are the result of the permeation with time and historical event. And as I talked that this right side of the city is bit of a bit of informal cities. We have taken this case of Shahabuddinpur village, which also comes towards the west side of the city, which also comes where most of those informal and unregularized settlements are being coming up. So at the center, you could see in this plan that the Shahabuddinpur village core has approximate 3,100 population with density of around 400 percent per hectare. And originally, the native community were Rajputs and Harijans, and adjoining them when the city is hitting the villages. So the in between land is being transformed, and that is the site where migrants are coming and they are producing their housing. Now, after tracing the growth of Shahabuddin from 1900s to 2023, this reveals a pattern of administrative lag. In 2023, the village was formally absorbed into municipal limits, but the revenue boundaries were fragmented in three separate wards. So, in this map, you can see that I have overlapped this map of revenue boundary with the city and overlapped the ward boundary with the city. So you could see that the when village, the Shahabuddinpur village was a revenue village, and then it was being transferred into municipal limit. Then those boundaries are not even coinciding with each other. And when they have made it as a within the municipal limits. So they have divided this revenue village in three different wards as to maintain a distribution of 500 person per ward. Even when you see the master plan, so master plan is also not following the ward boundaries. So master plan is saying a different scheme. Revenue boundaries say something else, and ward boundaries is totally disintegrated. And here we see that this classification trap, even as the city expands on paper, governance remains ambiguous. And this fragmentation isn't just a map error, it's a tool that complicates service delivery and keep these settlements in a state of tenuous belonging where the urban poor uh, is fighting for their rights. Now, taking understanding the history of this settlement, because the history of this settlement talks a lot about what has come near to it, and what kind of contestation are being happening there. So historically, this village as it named Shahabuddinpur village, but it was being administered by, and the most of the land belonged to Rajput community, and these Rajput people were having a larger tract of agricultural lands where most the Dalit communities where Dalit community were working on their farm fields. And Shahabuddinpur village has been considered as a Hindu settlement as per the like as per the demography. And towards the left of it, there is a Mimlana village, which is a Muslim settlement. And now, when we see the transformation of it, so we see that in 1990s, people have started changing the occupation pattern. The Rajput people who were actively involved in the agriculture, they have transformed their farmlands and they've started building these new industries of brick making. So now in the landscape, the brick kilns have emerged, which demanded labor. So agricultural land was being transformed, and then these new occupations have emerged. And this is story till 1990s, and after 1990s, we see that city has also started hitting the village towards. So here in the left side, towards the bottom, this was the city, and village was around 2 kilometers away from Muzaffarnagar. But now, if you see the present condition, Now we see this site of Shahabudinpur is a patchwork of agriculture land, real estate, county development, and a village core. And I also want to explain that historical planning mechanism like Ferni roads and Lal Dora boundaries continue to mediate space rather than facilitating integration. These devices often segmented territory and produce dead ends in the urban fabric. Now, so we must look at how legacy rural governance persists. Penny roads and Lal Dora boundaries now act as a special segments that perpetuate inequality. They hinder mobility and fragment the very open space that the laboring class relies on for social reproduction. Is my slide changing? Hello?
We can
Yes.
see the slide, which is historical devices. Yeah, now it's
Okay.
changing.
Now coming towards the mapping tool, mapping the open space network shows that functional commons like you use for cattle herding, gathering, and worship are now appearing under sprawl. Remaining spaces are often privatized or restricted by caste-based boundaries. For the informal city, open space is not a luxury, it is a livelihood infrastructure. This mapping of Shahabuddinpur shows that as farmlands are subdivided, the functional commons are lost, and they directly threatens the secondary livelihoods of the migrants and the native people of the place. And you could see that there is a stark divide in occupation and land ownership. In this map, you could also see that towards the right side of the settlement, we have the larger plots and larger houses, courtyard houses, which are being owned by the Rajput community. And towards this side of the road, we have the Dalit community, which are having a very small residential units. And beyond that, we have migrant housing, which is very disintegrated and disjointed, uh, uh, which we can see in the form of sprawl. Even when we talk about the public open spaces, the Thakur community owns a very much of large open spaces, and within the native Dalit community, we have varying scales of open spaces. And the most problematic things come when we talk about uh, this the sprawl where migrant people are where migrant people are being coming, because this being an unauthorized colonies, there is no provision of any open space or any community spaces. So this this is where there's a divide in occupation and land ownership, because the Rajput community retains ancestral wealth and industry control, while Dalits and migrants are uh, relegated to peripheral, less secure settlements and daily wage work. Now, this is also a very interesting map which shows that everything which is coming is following a logic of adjoining commonality, where migrant clusters cluster near historical caste and religious neighbors for security. Despite exclusion, these groups perform active placemaking by constructing their own temples and mosques. So here you could see that historically, Dalit community was being discriminated, and they were not even allowed to enter in the temples of the Rajput communities. But within last 15 years, there has been some sort of a change. There has been a new belonging. So you could see that this purple colored temple, which I've shown in this form of sketch. So new public spaces or new cultural spaces are being developed by the communities, and these are not being even provided by the city administration or the village administration. These are the work of the community. So we could see that the Ravidas temple has come just adjacent to the Rajput Guru Thakur Dwaras, and such And I would like to say that this informal city is not haphazard. It follows a social logic of kinship. Migrants settle near those with shared identities. Even the Muslim clusters are coming near historical Muslim areas and Dalits near existing hamlets. Crucially, They are building their own institutional presence, new temples and mosques as physical anchor of solidarity and claims to the city. This is an upcoming sense of belonging. And now, to conclude, we must stop seeing the informal city as a failure of planning. It is a negotiated outcome of a system that welcomes labor but excludes the laborers. The contestation over mosque, temple, and open spaces in reality is a contestation over who has the right to exist in the city. And if we come towards what should be like, these are the kind of discussion that what should be the solution. Because being an urban designer and planner, I think that there is a very much need of robust planning mechanism within the and where we have community participation and inter-agency integrations. And beyond master plans, we have to think about local area plans with the help of community and there's a need of system thinking approaches in reconceptualizing urban rural futures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akash. Yeah, can I ask everyone who is joining us online, yes, to put your cameras on? Thank you. So I think what an exceptionally what a lovely set of presentations to begin the conference with. This year's theme was to ask us to return to space, place, and scale, not just as settled backdrops, but contested terrains, right, where power travels, sticks, and is sometimes resisted. And all the panels today have spoken directly to that and have had really nice, beautiful, thick descriptions of both the places and the workers that they're trying to speak through. So I just want to compliment everyone for that. I just have a few comments and thoughts to share and some questions for the presenters. But of course, this is an opportunity for everyone to ask. So there will be mics that will go around. So please just raise your hands. But um, I think what we've seen across the presentations through Kerala, Surat, Ahmedabad, Bangalore, and Muzaffarnagar is that um, there are recurring spatial moves, right? So John's presentation describes how space and identity are recovered through protest, an enormous effort for the locals to see guests as residents. And Neha's work has described the way informal settlements create the conditions for exploitative forms of work and consumer markets to be created in cities. Nivedita and Geeta's work very eloquently shows us how Surat's reorganization of industrial space forces not just a resizing of industrial units, but it takes workers out of thick urbanisms that happen at the historical cause of cities into places where they have to kind of remake institutions, their identities, despite now being in the hands of rural governance institutions. Satya's work really nicely describes the close ties of political identity space, and for those who are able to create ownership over space despite forcibly being marginalized. And I compliment Satya on choosing to focus on auto drivers in his study of platforms, because that's a very understudied aspect of the gig economy. And finally, Shiraja's very lovely multi-layered articulation of social space as created through consumer demand and the laboring bodies of delivery workers kind of shows us how new forms of risks get reproduced and created as computational systems start to take over social phenomenon. And Akash's lovely work kind of helps show how unplanned expansion and classification systems can force people out of space. So lovely through lines through everyone's presentations. I think I have a set of questions I would like to ask each of you, and I'm going to take my role as a moderator and do that. So, John, and maybe we can keep our responses to about a minute short, so we can hear from the audience as well. But John's first, if I can ask you. How durable do you think the kind of placemaking based on protest is? What you described as a very difficult, tenuous process where people are forced into certain kinds of space. What kinds of solidarity do you think that can enable the continuity of that? Does space hold that? Does something else hold that? Maybe you can just respond and I can ask questions to the rest later.
So, as I mentioned in the paper, uh, this is this is just a momentary thing, but this solidarity that was made during this, and that is also like other people who were not part of this original group, they also understood, and in that informal market, that became a place, and there the solidarities came together So that is what I wanted to bring to the paper. The what these kind of spaces within the city that are not the cities that are hostile to the migrants, but within those cities there are spaces where they congregate, and how these places can act as solidarity or act as places for mobilization, and how can that lead to placemaking. That was what I wanted.
Okay. I think that shifts really nicely to Neha's presentation also, because Neha, your presentation was really talking about the interrelationships between informal settlements and informal work in a way, right? How both those forms of precarity are necessary for each other. So can you help us understand, really taking from John's presentation, where here we're talking about migrant construction workers, right? In Kerala in a very different context. What do you think the gig economy does to challenge what informal workers are already facing in cities, right? What's the specificity of gig work as an extension of informality, but different from other types of informal work that might interact with housing precarity in a large metropolitan city like New Delhi?
So yeah, I don't know if this answers your question, but like most of the people think that gig economy somehow give the workers a very like liberty to like work on their own timings and everything, but in reality it is not any different from the like what is already going on in the society in terms of informal labor, and in terms of the conditions and the challenges the informal workers face. So I feel like the gig workers is more like an extension of the already informal, like the situations and the conditions which is like very deep rooted in the society, and the general perception that it has given them the liberty and the freedom to like work on their own timings has nothing to do with the reality and the life they are having and the like work they are doing. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Nivedita, maybe I can ask you to tell us a little bit more about uh, what is the lived experience of these workers feel like when they are now in hands of panchayats and they are now out of dense city neighborhoods where they might have a bigger chance of anonymity and a certain ability to actually feel that they could make their city that space. What is that? What is the lived experience of that feel like?
Yeah, so a lot of these migrant workers in the urban peripheries, they occupy these residential spaces that are either within the industrial estates or in the immediate vicinity. And these spaces are virtually out of the panchayat's imagination of welfare provision and governance, as I also try to show in the presentation. So what then happens is that the workers find it a really unstable life. They don't look at this as something there is a permanent shift, so they are in a constant lookout for better opportunities, for better spaces to go to, and they are also willing to actually relocate to Surat if that means better work, because they have a support system in the city. The city is more familiar to them than these peripheries, where access to basic infrastructure, the nearest government hospital is like 25-30 kilometers away from the places they stay in. So really it's just like a matter of the like the kind of conditions that force them to stay in these spaces. But Geeta, if you want to elaborate further.
Yeah, I think it's also a way of the experience is also of permanent circular migration rather than being a shift to the city over a period of time. So, migration from Ganjam to Surat has been historical. So, these migrants have been coming into the city for generations and decades now. But there is no sense of permanent move to the city. These conditions are further perpetuating this circular mobility between the source and the destination, in this case Ganjam and Surat. And that, I think, is the this peripheralization is further accentuating that kind of mobility rather than creating a kind of a foothold in the city for migrant workers.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think Satya, your work is quite different in that the auto drivers I think that you're talking about are have a larger sense of ownership of space, right? There is a greater sense of belonging there. And it struck me the way you were talking about your case is also similar to how people have talked about Jakarta's Gojek drivers, right? That there has been a very um, spatially embedded sense of identity in different neighborhoods in Jakarta, which then had to interact somehow with platform logics to make this new kind of market work. So, can you actually help us think through? Is there a sense of global solidarity that can actually be created from some of these local experiences? How do you think these experiences work across the global south? Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
First of all, I would like to say that it's very surreal that because I started my IHS journey with Aditi ma'am, and now Aditi ma'am is asking me the question. So um, it's pretty surreal. And now to the question in hand. Interestingly, how do we understand global solidarities? How do auto rickshaw drivers understand global solidarities? Interestingly, one of the rickshaw union leaders, he's given his consent to name him, so I'm naming him. His name is Kishan Bhai. He's actually a part of this national level solidarity group called the International Federation for App-Based Transport Workers, called IFAT. And through that, he's been also able to get a sense, because he's very close to another major union leader called Sheikh Salahuddin. So there is a lot of sense of uh, of at least national level. I'm not sure if they've reached the global solidarity, but definitely at the national level, especially the motor vehicle aggregator guidelines, which were the central guidelines. Uh, they have created a sense of um, a shared exploitative practice that, and they have a shared sense that the state is in cahoots with the state, or the governments are in cahoots with different with these different digital platforms, and they're also a part of of various national and state level WhatsApp groups. So I think the digital space is also very important, because there are academicians, there are other national level gig union leaders uh, who know what's happening in, say say Jakarta, or say US, or say UK. So they keep on sharing these videos, and that's how they do get a sense that it's not they are not alone in this fight. If I'm making sense, that be it Bombay or be it Surat, I mean, be it Bombay or be it Delhi or be it even Hyderabad or somewhere in USA, New York especially. New York becomes every now and then. New York comes up in their discussions. So I
Mm.
do feel that there is a sense of global solidarity, but it's very surface level. But it is definitely there. I hope I did answer the question. It's more national solidarity. Global tak pahunchna bhi, it's not yet come yet. But yeah, I hope I answered.
No, absolutely. And I think there's something very unique about the transport worker identity when it comes to platformization. And it's really nice that it's coming out in your work. And actually, that brings me to Shrija's presentation, because food delivery workers are on bikes, yet they're not seen through their occupational identity, right? The present the fact of food delivery and the fact of there being food actually reshapes the market quite a lot. And you brought that up towards the kind of the last part of your presentation, where you said you want to also look at the way there's a homogenization of food culture. It also does feel like there's a lot of homogenization and flattening of all the effort and labor that goes into training some of these machine learning algorithms, like as you've kind of showed. Can you help us understand what what are the specificities of food delivery that actually do kind of change the way laboring bodies shape these computational systems, right? Uh, do other platforms work similarly? Do you think Satya's case would be similar to this? How do you can you help us understand the difference between types of platform workers and how their bodies are implicated in these systems?
Thanks, Aditi. That's actually a really, really great question. Um, I think, I think obviously, like platform apps themselves, like it is a spatial and temporal fix, and something like a ride-hailing app, something like Uber, Ola, they are very, very much tethered to your spatial location. So of course you have the necessity of that accuracy sort of showing up on a map. But what I mean, I do need a lot of work to do. I do have a lot of work to do in this, but from what I found out so far, you have a very specific sort of rhythm of your day that determines your food delivery patterns, right? So, like a ride hailing service could peak at any, there's no specific peak, whereas a food delivery service would peak at your meal slots. And that means those apps sort of push a very specific kind of accuracy that they want in terms of speeding that service up, which a ride hailing app does not necessarily need to fix, where they would work on your maps and routes. But in terms of changing the time it takes, food delivery apps really want to push that. And that's pretty much what I've found, if that answers your question.
No, absolutely. Um, if I had more time, I'd love to pose both the question to Satya and you, but maybe you don't have to answer it. But transport workers, especially auto drivers, have done a lot to actually make shifts in the national platform economy, right? In terms of the kind of dominant models, in terms of how commissions are allocated to workers or not. It would be lovely for you to maybe ask each other a question also about why food delivery cannot seem to allow more worker agency to take place, even though ride hailing and other types of transport work have. But I won't ask you to answer that. Um, Maybe I can open the floor up. Also, I realize that I've taken up a lot of time in this. There's a question at the back.
So just thank you so much for those papers. It was really nice. I'm Gautam. I teach here at IHS. Just one thing that I wanted to leave across to anyone who wants to pick it up. And I think that one of the things that I struggle with a lot is the continuing analytical and political work the category of the migrant does for us, right? Now, I'm thinking again about Surat, which is actually a majority migrant worker city, which means if 8 of every 10 workers are migrants, then what is the qualifier of migrant doing, right? And I'm looking at that same, Nivedita, in your work. The governance shifts and the outsider status that migration used to symbolize also comes from being rural, just like what you're saying, right? But that person just outside the municipality of Surat is not a migrant, but undergoes exactly what migration holds, right? And then sorry, I can't read anymore.
Shirija?
No,
John's?
John, sorry. It's like, wow, I need glasses. So, John's, in your work, it was like this move between a migrant protest and a worker protest, and then a migrant worker protest. And just to think, I think this is something that we all collectively have to think about. We can't let go of the category. It has administrative lives and legal lives. But analytically, what life does it have? Politically, what life does it have, right? So if someone has come from Ganjam to Surat for generations, at what time does it stop? Because then that contention between migrant and resident is also being reproduced by us analytically. It's not just being reproduced by exclusion. So just to think about this category and to tussle with it a bit more, I think it keeps sneaking into our work. But at what point do we not allow it to do that work?
Do we have any more questions from the ground? So maybe we can have some of you respond to that. Would anyone like to go? John's.
Yeah, in my case, I was referring to specifically interstate migrant workers who are coming from eastern side and like other places to Kerala. So that is in the case of Kerala, the interstate migration it happened in the 90s. That was mostly from Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. But now, because of rapid urbanization and all, the migration is from very far away places. So then that is how I use the term migrant worker, and the distance linguistically and culturally between these workers and the local workers who have the protection of unions are large. That's how I made that distinction in my case.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that was a lovely kind of thoughtful analytical question for us to pause on. And I think we can end the panel here. And I want to thank everyone for presenting. And I would love for you all to also keep in touch, because as I was saying earlier, there's a lot of beautiful ways in which you can build on Doreen Massey's work, and I hope that's a conclusion that we can have for the day as well. So thank you so much.